I know, but it remembers.
Oh, that was working. That'll be a pain for
I know, exactly.
Oh, can you, maybe it's...
All right, we'll get started, and I'll get Andy mic'd up in a few minutes. Good morning. Thanks for coming to the April SCCR Science Series. I just have a couple of announcements before I introduce Andy. And the first one is the Clinical Research Operations Program core course, Understanding Phases of Research and Clinical Trial Study Design, which will be presented by myself and Haley Hedlund from the QSU. Will be presenting from 1 to 2:30 on April 18th. So I encourage you all to sign up for that course if you haven't participated yet. And then the next two science series, May will be on infectious diseases. So we're going to be talking about the immune system, when the immune system becomes compromised, how our bodies fight off infection, and then we'll talk about some specific case studies related to nosocomial infections. That's on Tuesday, May 8th from 9 to 11. And then the June Science Series is a little bit kind of like this one. It's not so scientific in nature. We're going to be talking with the Center for Digital Health and doing a workshop with them on Thursday, June 7th from 9 to 11. And they're going to be talking about some of the current topics that they're doing and projects that they're doing in the CDH, and also talking about the projects we're helping them with in SCCR. So that brings me to introducing our speaker, Andy Chang. So Andy is a clinical instructor and health services researcher at Stanford and in the Department of Medicine and also the Division of Hospital Medicine. He's a graduate of the Stanford Internal Medicine and Global Health Residency programs and a former chief resident, and he will begin his cardiovascular fellowship here at Stanford in July. His current professional interests include epidemiology. He's also going to be graduating from the master's program in June. He's interested in qualitative research and health services research focused on heart disease in the developing world. His long-term interests include developing and researching appropriate technologies and innovations for use in low-resource settings with an emphasis on design thinking and social justice. And he's also a TL1 NIH grant funded by Spectrum. So, and that is it. So please help me welcoming Andy. We appreciate him being here. And I will go get you another microphone.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Karen. That was probably the lengthiest introduction I've ever gotten, so I guess it's nice to feel important every now and then. All right, so a couple disclaimers. I am post-call, which means I've gotten about roughly 4 hours of sleep in the last 48 hours, but I think that'll make me much more honest, which will make for a very, very, potentially very interesting discussion today. Okay, so everyone in the back can hear me okay? Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a subject that everyone has some interaction with, and that's social media. And so before we get into the meat of the material, we're going to start with our learning aims and our questions. So how many people here read XKCD? Yes, we have some XKCD people, so it's an online comic. It's written by actually a scientist, and I think a lot of the stuff is super relevant and super entertaining as well, too. So I find learning objectives, and declarative statements like that to be a little bit misleading, because I can't guarantee that I'm good enough a teacher that, that at the end of the session the learners will actually be able to do these things. And so I'm going to pose a few questions in the learning objectives, and hopefully these are some things that I'll go over and you'll be able to at least discuss in some level. So the first question is, why should we care about social media as healthcare researchers and healthcare providers? The second question is, what are the apps and what's so great about them? We'll talk about if this all matters at all to us and to whom. And then the $1 billion question is social media broken, and how can we fix it? And then at the very end, we'll do a little bit of a Q&A. I know we initially said that we'd have some representatives from the privacy office, but unfortunately we were unable to get that, but we do have representatives from the IRB here available, so please direct all your difficult questions to them. All right, so some ground rules. So we are a community of learners gaining understanding through the sharing of knowledge and experience, and so everyone should feel comfortable asking questions at any time, so feel free to interrupt me at any point. And we will model professionalism through a demonstration of humility and respect for our colleagues. And it's not just people in the room, that's people outside of the room as well too, and that's particularly important today because I am going to be using real examples from real social media accounts, including some potentially familiar faces that you might see around campus here. So my disclosures, I don't have any commercial disclosures. I'm not nearly important enough for that. But most and more importantly, I have no social media industry disclosures. But I do have to disclose that I do get salary support and educational funding from the NIH's TL1 program, which is run through Spectrum here at Stanford. And we have Jessica Meyer in the back. Thank you very much. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So, part one. Welcome to the Web 2.0. I intentionally found the campiest looking graphic for this part. So, what is the Web 2.0? So it's a term that was actually coined by Darcy DiNucci, who was a tech writer in 1999, and it was popularized by Tim O'Reilly and Dale Doherty in the early part of the early 2000s. The idea is that the fundamental structure of the internet has really changed in the past decade, and we've all lived it, so I don't think I really have to explain that it has happened. But let's just humor me for a second, and we'll go down memory lane real quick. This is what the internet looked like back in the old days, and I'm old enough to actually remember what this looked like, and there might be some young people who are like, what is that? So this is a old GeoCities website, and back then, basically, information was unilaterally and unidirectionally transferred, meaning someone with the knowledge and the power to be able to do it would own a website, would open a site and have information, and we, the plebeians, would basically get to read it, and that was kind of about it. But then that's really changed over the course of the last decade, and now we've got what we call the Web 2.0, and that involves a lot of different elements, but specifically they include things like commenting systems. You have wikis and user-generated content. You've got online communities and forums, which are really in the mainstream. They did exist in the old days, but now you can find them everywhere. There's also tagging, so you can tag individuals as well as themes. And then finally, social media, and this has really facilitated mass participation in social media. And so really the net result is that the internet is an active participatory medium now rather than unilateral, unidirectional method for transfer of knowledge. And it's pretty big of a deal because there's already 3 billion people around the world now who are on social media. And that's about almost half the world's population, and that's only going to grow because there's 5 billion unique mobile device users, so we're not even quite halfway there yet. And before you think, oh, social media is just for young people, the penetrance is actually pretty high. So this is from the Pew Research Center, which I really love, and it's looking at U.S. Adults, so 18 years and up. So we are missing a chunk of the millennials. And what you could see is that, unsurprisingly, your 18 and 29-year-olds are really, very highly saturated. And then, here I am in the 30 to 49-year-old group. We're doing not too bad. But then by the time we get to my mom's age, I mean, we're north of 50, approaching 3/4, and 65 is not doing too shabby at 33% too. So it's not just young people who are using social media. This is really the demographic of the entire country being involved. And yet, despite the fact that so many people are on social media, as a healthcare profession, we are a little bit behind the ball. So less than a third of healthcare and research organizations actually have specific social media guidelines, and only a quarter of U.S. hospitals participate in social media. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the modalities. And it does seem overwhelming because there's so many of them, and they all seem the same. So here they're saying, you should join Google+. What is it? It's not Facebook. What's it like? Well, Facebook. Oh, well, it's basically what they all are. But they are all a little bit different, and that's important because they have differences and similarities that make them relevant to us as researchers and healthcare providers. So it's a little bit dizzying to think about all the different social networking applications that are out there. And so there's actually a cool taxonomy that was proposed by Egner and Jacob a couple years back. And so they actually have a hierarchy and a taxonomy for all the different sites, and I'm going to try do it some justice. So we obviously have the social media networks, and these are the ones that are the best known. So these are the things like Facebook, Google+. VK, I don't really know much about it. All I know is that it's the Russian Facebook. I guess they got tired of hacking our data and decided to make their own. But so yeah, and then there's China is actually another place where social media networks are really, really big and have large numbers of individuals, and we don't even know, they're sort of these sleeping giants, really. So next we've got blogs, which for those of us who are older like myself might be familiar with as sort of the original incarnation of social media. And these are things like MySpace, Blogger, and Tumblr. And they were very, very popular and at one point were the dominant mode of social media, but really gave away. And part of that had to do with the rise of microblogs. And these are things like Twitter and Vine. And instead of posting these long, very difficult to write posts about your, online diary, now you get 280 characters to very succinctly share your opinions very quickly. And so microblogs are there. And then you have business networks, and these are things like LinkedIn, which is basically Facebook for professionals. And then you have Doximity, which is even narrower. It's basically Facebook for healthcare providers. You've got collaborative projects now, like Wikipedia, where pretty much all the content is generated by the public. And then just a shout out to Wikidoc, which is run by C. Michael Gibson over at Harvard. And it's Wikipedia specifically run by and for healthcare professionals. And then we have forums, so you guys might have heard about Reddit, and here the social media is really about the discussion rather than the individual. And then just another shout for the internationality of it, there's Taringa, which is I think the largest Spanish language forum, and I'd never heard of it before, but boasts many, many millions of readers. So a lot of these phenomenon that I'm talking about are not just in the United States and not just English language. They have their analogs that are very, very large internationally as well too. And then we have photo sharing applications, so things like Instagram, Flickr, and Snapchat. Primarily, it's not so much about connecting with individuals as it's about sharing photographs, and Snapchat in particular basically deletes the photograph or supposedly deletes them after a short time period. And we have products and service review, so things like Yelp and Google Guide, and there's myriad other smaller websites like Angie's List, for example, that allow you to rate various things. Then we have social bookmarking like Pinterest, which some of you guys might be familiar with, where it's, again, not so much about the individual as it is about finding and sharing pre-existing links and sites and resources that are on the web. And then we have group texting networks, so this is a very, very stripped down version of social media. So things like WhatsApp and GroupMe, where it's really only the individuals you know, and it has turned chatting using text messages into sort of a social media of sorts. And then we also have video sharing, so YouTube, Dailymotion, you're probably familiar with. And then lastly, this is kind of interesting. There's this movement called the digital self that's really gained steam over the course of the past decade. And the idea is that you can use these networking sites and applications to share metrics about yourself. So how many people here know or use Strava? Okay, cool. And so Strava allows you, it uses the GPS on your phone to track your distance and your time for when you run or cycle. I don't dare go on there because I'll find all my attendings who are like double, triple my age, able to do half my time on some of these runs. But then Fitbit also will, create these communities and show your progress. And this one's kind of cool and interesting. It's a site called Sugar Stats, where if you're a diabetic, you can actually show your glucose control, which is pretty cool. And I'm really going to focus on the highlighted four because they really are the big four here. All right. So, I talked a little bit about, the modalities. How many people do you think are actually on these sites? Any guesses? How about Facebook? How many people do you think are on Facebook? 2 billion. 2 billion? Hundreds of millions. Okay, cool. Yeah, actually, whoever said that was perfect. Is 2.1 billion people on Facebook, 1.5 on YouTube, almost 1 million on Instagram now, and Twitter is well over a third of a billion. And this is actually old data because this is from 2017, so the numbers are probably higher than that now. So it's a lot of penetration in this market. And so I'm going to go through each one of them one by one and talk a little bit about what makes them good or bad for social media, so for researchers and for health professionals. So the first is Facebook. So how many people here have a Facebook account? Yeah, all right. So we're going to talk a little bit about the problematic aspects of some of these things in a little bit. So I'm just going to share some of the bare bones aspects of these modalities. So the nice thing is it's the biggest social media platform. It is, it's the Death Star of social media. And originally it was meant to be closed for individuals, and what that means is that you need approval from somebody else in order to access their site and vice versa. So you know that most of the people who are seeing your content have some level of approval to see that. But in order to allow for public access, you can also create groups which can be both private or open for special interest. And of course there's bad stuff. So since you as a personal account really only have the people in your social network that can see yours, it does increase the danger of creating sort of this echo chamber effect where all the things that you're sharing are to similar people who you know who are like-minded. There's also a lot of personal information, which we found out the hard way with a lot of recent security breaches, and perhaps some sites, for example, like Instagram, don't even give you the amount of space to be able to share nearly the extent of personal information that Facebook does. So the next one is YouTube. And so it's obviously nice because it's video content, and as you can imagine, this gives it another dimension on top of text only or images like some of the other social media applications. It is very big. A lot of people use it, and the educational potential is really, really big on this because again, it's video rather than text or image. Unfortunately, there are some bad parts to it. Because it is open commenting, pretty much anybody, anywhere on the internet can leave their comments about what they think about your excellent or not so excellent video. And as you can imagine, you really need the skill set to be able to make good, compelling content. I mean, certainly you could just, turn your, smartphone around and capture some video of yourself, but the best, most compelling content tends to be pretty highly sort of digitally worked up. Next, we've got Instagram. So Instagram is nice because it's an image-based platform rather than text. Also, it has built-in filters, so it makes anybody with a phone look like a professional photographer, potentially. And it is open, just like YouTube, as I mentioned, so anyone can access your profile. And bad parts, because it's image first and partly by design, posting large amounts of text is problematic. Also, you can't really share posts. So Facebook, for example, has the share function. Twitter has retweets. It's much harder to share other people's and other individuals' posts on Instagram, which really does mean that you kind of have to generate your own content. And again, as I mentioned, because it is open, anyone can see and comment on your posts. And then next we have Twitter, which is my preferred account. And oh, look, it's my boss, Dr. Harrington, who's the department chair for medicine. Anyway, Twitter's nice because it's really, really short. You can't put more than 280 characters. So it really puts the emphasis on you to be brief. And really the idea is that you convey an idea and a single idea at that too. And as a result, the posts can be generated incredibly rapidly. And to give you an example, this is happening on the level of minutes to seconds. So for example, anytime I wake up in the middle of the night and there's a little bit of a tremor, I wonder if, was that an earthquake? The first place I go is not the TV, but Twitter, because within minutes, people are going to be saying, oh, I think there was an earthquake. And certainly on an individual level, it might not be intelligent because, some people might think it's an earthquake, some people might not. But when you start seeing, hundreds of tweets now mentioning that, then there's this sort of wisdom of the crowd that emerges. And on top of which, actually, there's also bots, and these are the good kinds of bots. So the U.S. Environmental Service actually has a seismic detection bot. So within seconds of there being an earthquake, the bot will just, tweet out we detected X, on the Richter scale in Northern California, for example. So it happens very, very fast. It's also open, so anyone can access your profile. They do not have to be friends. Anyone can follow you on any part of the world. And one nice feature that Twitter has is that it has what are called verified profiles. And so if you are a public figure or important enough, certainly more important than I am, you can actually apply to get a verified profile. And what that means is that Twitter will actually put a little, watermark on your profile to say, we verified that this individual is who they are. So I'm not verified, for example, so there could be another, Andy Chang somewhere on the internet, claiming to be me, but for the verified profiles, that's not the case. So cons, understandably, anyone can see and comment on your posts, so complete random strangers can see and be enlightened and educated, but can also, spread spam or, pick fights with you. And we have the issue of, again, bots, which are primarily the biggest issue on Twitter as well as Facebook. So I'm going to take a quick second and actually go over the anatomy of a tweet. I don't know if this is... Let's see. All right, cool. So this is my Twitter account, which you can see here, and I'm going to point out some features to it. So you have your profile picture, you can pin some tweets, and one of the nice things is you can use several functions here. How many people here actually have Twitter accounts? Okay, great. So it's going to be review for some people, but the nice thing is you can find individuals. So for example, I'm going to find my friend Jonathan. And John is one of our data scientists here. We went to residency together, and he's an assistant professor here right now with hospital medicine as well, too. So I can actually take a look at Jonathan's tweets and see some of the things that he's talked about. So Jonathan is advertising, oh, how interesting, the upcoming AI in medicine conference. So I can like it, which basically just shows that I'm publicly supporting it. I can retweet it. And what that means is that I am now posting this to my own Twitter front page, or I can actually reply, for example, and say, cool conference. John's going to wonder. I didn't ask him for permission to do this, so he's going to be like, why am I getting so many messaging alerts? So there we go. And then next, you can create your own tweets. So here I'm going to tweet. I'm going to say, I'm excited to share media. And you'll notice I'm using what's called a hashtag. I don't know if you guys can see it, but it's basically the pound sign. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that. I'm going to say, for being a part, I'm actually going to tag John in it now. Yeah, now he's going to be really confused now. And so you'll notice that here there's an @ sign, and an @ means that it's somebody's account. And so now John's going to get an alert saying that I'm tweeting him. And as you can see, you also have the hashtag. So let me go back to my... John's probably gotten like 10. So now you can go and see that I have retweeted John's post, and here is my post on my own site as well too. And what's interesting is you'll notice is that there's blue text here, and so hashtag social media, if I click that now, it will show pretty much every single post on Twitter having to do with social media that has also been tagged social media. So it's obviously a very broad tag, but you can sort of get a sense of the power of this medium. Okay, any questions about Twitter? All right, I know John will have quite a few questions. Okay, let me get back to... Give me 1 second. we go. Yes.
Is there like a mailing list of the system?
Yeah, absolutely. You can flood it. What's interesting is that's what you're describing is what a lot of bots do, and so it's artificial intelligence that's been coded to take advantage of the system and do that. And so there's a lot of sort of anti-bot software where, for example, I believe in an earlier incarnation, I don't know if it's the case right now, but there's limits on how many posts you can make it. So there are limits to prevent that kind of behavior that are built into the algorithms. Okay, so any questions up to this point? Okay. Another quick slide is who's using what types of social media. So I think Facebook, for example, has pretty good representation regardless of the age group, but you could see that certain modalities, there's definitely differences based on your age group. So things like Snapchat have very high penetrance in the young group and very, very low penetrance if you're over 50. And so you can kind of get a sense of what your demographic is. So if you plan on using it to spread information about your research or about health behaviors, you can get a very good sense of what age group you're likely to hit based on the modality. Okay. All right, so next part. Does social media really matter? All right, so we're going to break it down and talk about stakeholders. And so the first question is, does it matter to the public? So back to the Pew Research Center, they had a great study last year, and it was a broader study about social media in general, not just social media and science. But one of the things that they found was that a lot of people are actually using social media for science-related things. So 26% of the U.S. Social media users actually follow a science-related page, and about a third of them said that it's an important way they get science news, and almost half said that they see science news there that they wouldn't get anywhere else. And there's some anecdotal evidence to suggest that more and more people of all age groups are unplugging from traditional media like print newspapers or magazines or television and actually getting their news almost exclusively from social media. And this study came out last month. This is also the Pew, which is kind of a follow-up to that. And so they looked at the 30 most subscribed science-related pages on Facebook, and they followed them for 6 months to get a better sense of what people were actually seeing. And what they found was that this really large potential reach. So these are all individual sites, and they just looked at the 30 most followed, but you can see National Geographic here has 44 million followers, Discovery is 39, IFL Science, which is sort of a grassroots created one, has almost 26 million. So, in some we're talking about hundreds of millions, and this is not including individuals who posted, shared or reposted posts from these sites. These are just the individuals and the posts from people who are subscribed to these sites. So there's probably a multiplicative effect as well too. And we'll get back to this study, so keep it in mind. So the next question is, does it matter to patients? So understandably, the retweet and the share functions on Facebook are super convenient because we can use it to share health information. And sure enough, almost half of individuals in this one survey said that they use information from social media to deal with their health. And about a third of respondents said information from social media does affect their decision whether or not to take medications. And then this is a fun one. 90% of millennials actually said that they would trust medical information shared by others on their social media network. Yeah, so I mean, it's some important stuff here. And so another question is, so how exactly are patients using social media? One of them is pretty obvious, and that's to connect with other patients and caregivers. And so it's nice because these sites have allowed people to create networks. For example, this one is Memory People, is created actually by a gentleman and his wife, and he actually developed dementia, and so it was sort of a way for people to connect. But you can see, for example, the Susan G. Komen Association. It can be either directional. It's either from bottom up or from top bottom. People use it, as I mentioned, to rate. So there are other sites, but we're looking at Yelp here. And so here's Stanford Healthcare. 2.5 stars. Packard's doing a lot better, so they're at 3 stars, and I guess the Cancer Center is doing a really good job because here we are at 4 stars over here. And what's interesting is you'll note that people actually will use, oftentimes, I don't really know if Yelp was built to to critique hospitals, and yet people still use it because it's really available and out there. And I think obviously these numbers are probably a little bit on the skewed side because people tend to report and share things when they're angry about things. I think there's plenty of happy customers that aren't talking about their experiences, and we know that to be true. And before we feel too sorry for ourselves, here's a Palo Alto Medical Foundation right down the street, and they're also at 2.5 stars, so we're doing okay. And another interesting thing, here's Stanford Family Practice, N is only 11, but I mean 4.5 stars, that's really great. But I brought up this post because here is Dr. Wendy Caceres in the Department of Medicine, who's one of my former classmates and an amazing physician. And this one's great. This is a very complimentary message for Dr. Wendy Caceres, even though her name is spelled wrong. But I bring this up because there's no policing mechanisms here, so anyone can write anything about anybody. So there's a good chance that someone in this room, maybe myself, is mentioned in one of these reviews, and we have no way. For example, there's, in Twitter culture, it's considered respectful to use the @ sign so that if you are mentioned, you get him, like John knows that he's being talked about right now in this room. Whereas you are not going to see that in things like Yelp. Here is another way patients use social media. So patients can use it to share their stories, and we can get a much more intimate understanding than sometimes words do. So this is actually a site. She's a lung transplant recipient, and so she shares her experiences about it. And because this is Instagram, this is freely available. Anyone with an internet account can hop on and learn all about her story and see the photos of the people in her lives, and in some cases some of the procedures they have to go through. And the other reason why I bring this up is because your patients and your study subjects might be microblogging about you, and you might not even know. For example, these healthcare providers here are obviously in the know on this one, but imagine there might be other individuals who are not aware that their likeness is being posted all over social media, where pretty much anyone with an internet account or a cell phone can access or see these things. Okay, and so part 3, does it really matter to researchers? So. We're actually pretty good at creating content ourselves. We were the original content creators, and so researchers, there's about 2.5 million research articles that are published every year. But how much of it is actually getting out of there? This is a really controversial number, but supposedly up to half of research articles don't actually get read by anyone other than the authors, the editors, and the reviewers. And I actually did hunt this statistic down because I was like, this is too big to be true. And it turns out there is sort of a little bit of a wild goose chase, and where it ends is that there's some, expert opinion rather than specific research behind it. But I think the fact that things like this have been mentioned by researchers in the academic field means that a lot of research goes unread by people other than academics. Yes?
Paper was published research,
Mm-hmm.
and it was looking at very few people get journals anymore,
Mm-hmm.
and people who look at it in such a short time, they read the title.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct.
I think that's a real.
Yeah. And I'll touch on this a little bit more again too, but unfortunately I brought up the echo chamber effect, and unfortunately the possibility is very real that we're sort of creating our own very highly educated academic echo chamber, while everyone else is out there on Facebook getting their data from that. This here is some real research. This is a pretty nifty paper that was in JMIR, which actually looked at highly tweeted articles, obviously within the journal itself, and found that the more highly tweeted these articles were, the more they were likely to be cited. So there's something to be gained about sharing your research on social media. And to take a step back and look at it from a philosophical perspective, so many of us are funded by taxpayer funding. For example, the NIH or NSF, and even private foundation grants. Since we are the recipients of this, we are kind of beholden to our investors to share, what we're doing with that money, and in good faith show that we're providing a good return on investment. And then lastly, it is important to us so that we can disseminate research. So in a very fortuitous moment, I had a paper that was published in an open access journal basically 2 weeks ago, and so I actually got to track my own reads. And so this is Public Library of Sciences 1 + 1, and a lot of, especially open access journals nowadays, actually show you your statistics on your papers and how well they're doing. And sure enough, what I found, and unfortunately I didn't track the data, and PLOS doesn't present it granularly enough. It's done on a monthly basis. You can actually track and see when it is, and sure enough, I was getting a lot of hits on my article after the social media blitz came. It got released sort of in late March, and what I actually found was that sort of that transitionary period got a lot of reads. And what's cool is that it'll also share how people are reading your article, whether it's by PDF downloads, are they getting it off PubMed, or versus off the internet. And this is old information, but it'll also track the shares, so how many people have shared specifically this article on Twitter or other social media. You can tell I'm working with a lot of integrity, because I could have artificially increased this number, but I chose not to. All right, so now we get into some really heavy stuff. So is social media broken? And it's a timely issue because it's been in the news a lot. And so we're going to do the good, the bad, the ugly, except we're going to start with the ungood. So we're going to talk a little bit about actual media itself. And this is obviously from news, but it's definitely the case with social media as well, too. So here we are back with that Pew Research study that I mentioned earlier. So one of the issues is that the quality of available information is debatable, and that's one of the things that they found. So remember that study where they looked at the 30 most subscribed websites on Facebook dealing with science, and they found that only 29% of those Facebook science page posts were actually new discoveries. And 21% were news you can use, and then basically the remaining third were promotions and ads, reposts, or posts completely unrelated to science. So the signal-to-noise ratio is not terribly good. And even this news you can use is a pretty variable quality. So here's an example. This is actually the one that they give in their report. How to get healthy and shiny hair using an egg and olive oil. I guess I'm going to have to try that. But as you can see, as is the case with this post, it's one of the 87% of those posts that don't list their sources for what they're talking about. And so a lot of this stuff is can't actually be traced back to any real research or science. And then, of course, there's the threat of pseudoscience and fake news. So I'm bringing this up again so that you guys can get a shot of what the big things are. But there's a lot of questionable content up on especially the Facebook primary sites as well too. For example, let's see, David Wolf here has 11 million subscribers specifically, and he's actually not a scientist. He is an entrepreneur. And so here's a collection of some of his social media comments. Former Merck employee tells all, are vaccines safe? She says no. Conquer cancer via complementary medicine. Of course, the free summit is being delivered by him. This one's pretty great. Stop the chemical tic-tac-toe, stop chemtrails, which for people who are aware is pretty hardcore conspiracy theory about these harmless vapor trails being, I guess, mind control technologies. So, I mean, this is the stuff that's passing as science on some of these Facebook pages, at least to 11 million people. So, a little bit of a deeper dive. I know this is starting to get depressing, but 4 of the top 15 highest engaged posts from these Facebook primary sites actually had inspirational sayings or other non-science topics. So the most highly engaged posts aren't even about science too. And so again, we're harping on David Wolf, and smart is the new sexy. I agree with that. But either way, these sites, about a third of these posts were actually non-science related posts. And I'm going to show you the post that had the greatest engagement, and this is in October 2015. There were 5.4 million interactions with this one. And This is what it is. Oh, it's our friend David Wolf again. Share this if you think they should have this in school. I mean, I'm with him. I would love to have, had kiwis in my lunch, but, this isn't actionable. It has nothing to do with the actual issues of health policy and nutrition that are really in our country, right? Let's forget about the kiwis. We have to start with, let's start small. Let's get bananas and oranges into school. And so, there's certainly a push for sensationalism here. And despite all that, Facebook actually shies quite a bit away from controversial topics. So only 1% of posts on Facebook primary pages in that Pew study actually discuss climate change. Only 1% discuss GMOs. 1% mentioned vaccines. Less than 1% mentioned the March on Science. So, it doesn't mean that, that we're super excited about engaging with difficult topics either. My favorite sign from the March for Science. Even within forums which have specialized knowledge, there's some variation in information as well too. So this is an abstract that just got presented at AHA Core about a week or so ago. This is Nopke and his group based out of University of Colorado. And they looked at 2 years worth of information about basically implantable defibrillators on these online message boards dedicated to these devices. And I also only found that about only 50% of the information that was being shared was actually correct and useful. So about a quarter was bad advice that wouldn't really help patients. About a fifth of it, there was not enough context, and 6% was actually controversial. So even within specialized social media sites, that are about specific topics, there's quite a bit of room to go to get better. And then we talked about the ungood, and then now we're going to talk about the bad. There's an elephant in the room, namely fake news. And so, 2016 and the election really opened a lot of people's eyes to the issue of fake internet news. But in a sense, science and medicine were actually the original canaries in the coal mine about this, because there was already data, or fake news being posted about things like, the dangers of vaccines and global warming, many years before, this election cycle and all of this was going on. And as you can imagine, because social media can really virally spread information, it can also virally spread disinformation. And we talked about the bots before too. Anyone could write an algorithm that can disguise itself as a person. And you can actually leverage social media using the very algorithms that the social media that they run on to spread your message to get more clicks, to get more ads, or for more nefarious purposes if, they're political in nature. And bots have no regard for the health or scientific implications of the messages that they share. And then, unfortunately, the social media networks themselves actually don't have the technical or medical expertise or the manpower for that matter to police these things, because as you can imagine, there are literally billions of posts being created. And so, how can Facebook or Twitter recruit a team of individuals to verify every single one of those tweets? It's not possible. And in fact, some of them, like Reddit, don't police. In fact, Reddit is very proud of the fact that they are the purveyors of internet free speech, where anything goes, no matter how wrong or anything. They're very big on not policing. So, this is a sort of a new paradigm that we're seeing. Unfortunately, social media by design is actually complicit as well too, because at the end of the day, most of these sites are actually trying to generate ad revenue. And so the more you click, the more money they make. And so regardless of the content, they want to see more clicks. And so some of the actual artificial intelligence algorithms built in, like autoplay, or recommended posts or recommended pages, are actually built to, I'm not going to mince words, addict the users, because they want to keep you locked in. They want you to keep watching, keep reading, keep clicking. And so what people have found is that as a result, the algorithms provide increasingly extremist viewpoints, because you're more likely to build sort of an emotional response to what you're reading when that happens. And so there's been some it's an interesting article in the New York Times where there's a whistleblower talks about their time working with, I think, YouTube, and about these algorithms that they disagreed with. And then, of course, there is the ungood, the bad, and the downright ugly. So ultra topical, I think today is day 3 now of the congressional hearings on Facebook. And so it brings up a really important question, is social media actually bad for us? So, as the aforementioned Facebook thing shows with Cambridge Analytica, and the Russian interference, we do know that loss or malicious use of personal data through either breaches or by design, sold to the highest bidder, I think on a emotional level, we understand that that's bad for us and that's not good, and it compromises our faith in these systems. But also, there's some evidence to suggest that social media itself actually has negative health impacts on the people who use them. So, for example, people who there's a variety of studies have shown that people who use social media will have more depressed mood. People use it for cyberbullying. The anonymity and the relative anonymity of these sites facilitates people saying things that they probably wouldn't say to other people face to face. There's a social isolation, which is a little bit paradoxical. I think when some people are on social media and looking at all these other people having a wonderful time without them can amplify those feelings. And also poor body image, because these sites are so meticulously created for self-promotion. I think we can get a very unrealistic expectation, of body image, of how happy people are on these sites and, how much fun they're having. And that doesn't necessarily reflect reality. And I think our brain, or at least on an unconscious level, recognizes that dissonance as unhappiness. And there's tons and tons and tons of studies, about these effects. So any questions up to this point? Because we've brought up a lot of the ugly and the depressing things. I have 2 questions at the back. We'll do the first in the front and then the back. Lindsay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's actually a fantastic question and was recently the source of a lot of discussion, both in person and over Twitter. And one of the things that people were saying is if you are willing to publish it and speak about this at a conference, then you're okay with it being spread out into the wild. Will not mention, but a very large professional society meeting actually last year attempted to prevent tweeting of information and actually received a ton of backlash from not just social media users, but also from the scientists saying, again, it goes back to who is this research for? And, does it really make sense for us to be reporting on research if we don't feel comfortable sharing it with the public? And so I think overall, due to the backlash, it was removed. And so I think there's a strong current of belief that if you present it at a conference, that it deserves to be shared with the world. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Whether people will take that for you or just say no.
Mm-hmm.
When you're studying what's presented at meetings and what's in the
Yep, that's correct. Correct. And then Lindsay in the back. Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, I think on some level, the democratization has good things in the sense that, it prevents, we tend to be, ivory tower institutions, and so it kind of tips the balance of power a little bit back towards patients. But you were totally right that, there could be public shaming, and individuals don't really have the opportunity to reply to some of these things. And I think we're still in that stage where it is a little bit of the Wild West. I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a second, but I think it is up to us to be more engaged and be a part of that discussion so that we can work into these companies and into these sites to help provide the other side. I think by nature, healthcare providers and researchers tend to be a little bit more, stay away from the public eye, sort of let sleeping dogs lie. And I think that's one area where we have not done ourselves good service. Great. All right, so so this next part is how we fix a lot of the problems, and how we fix it actually has a lot to do with why it's broken. And the reason it's broken is a lot of the things that I mentioned. There's a lot of issues, and a lot of them deal with issues that are much bigger than us as healthcare providers and researchers, having to do with, say, the payment models or the monetization of some of these things. And I'm not going to try to get into that because it's kind of outside the scope of this talk. But I think there are things that we can do in our respective roles to make these communities better and make them run better. So the first thing I bring up is, should we fix it? I mean, what's to prevent us from just saying, forget it? Hashtag delete Facebook, and we can watch from the sidelines as it sinks into the sea. And I think it's because we actually don't have that option, because we created social media. So humans, as inherently social animals, I think we will create whatever means are at our disposal, whether they be, smoke signals or, or the Pony Express or social media. We'll always find ways to attempt to connect with one another and share ideas. And regardless of whether, we, meaning we as individuals, choose to participate in social media, it's still going to be affecting our patients. They're going to be getting all kinds of disinformation on it. It's going to be affecting our peers. It's going to be affecting our study subjects as well as the public. So I think just to say I'm off of it doesn't capture our role and sort of our obligation towards our peers and our patients who are going to be on these media. And ultimately, systems that are created by the powers that be may stack the deck towards their purposes and their external purposes. But at the end of the day, I mean, we are the product. We create the drive, we create the impetus for these types of things. So I think part of it is since we are the product, we should own it. And on a even more serious note, I think we shouldn't unplug because the stakes are way too high. So the topics that were under debate, things like climate change, healthcare reform, NIH funding, and in fact, participatory democracy, as we found out, these are really, really big issues, and they matter way too much for us just to sit, on the sidelines and watch while it's happening. And we as scientists, as researchers, we may inform policy, but we can't forget that at the end of the day, those policies are signed into law behind votes that are driven by the public. And so, especially recently, there's been sort of this global trend towards populism and anti-intellectualism and mistrust of the academic profession. And I think, if we lose that public PR battle, I think that we could potentially find ourselves shut out of the conversation. So I think it's really important for us the stakes are really high. And finally, I think it's a public health mandate. So if it's true that social media is potentially harmful for us from a health issue, then I think as healthcare providers and health researchers, we have a public health mandate to actually study these things and figure out how to improve it or how to regulate it. And before we say, oh, but that's innovation and free speech, well, there's a lot of things that we enjoy and that are ubiquitous that researchers and physicians have gotten behind. And these are things like food products, motor vehicles, community design, alcohol. So I think this is just another one of those similar idea. And I spent a lot of time talking about the gloomy aspects of things, but I think you can have something that's broken and wonderful all at the same time. And so never forget the original purpose of social media was actually to connect individuals, and I think it still has that power. And so one of the things that really inspires me is looking at support groups, especially for rare diseases and minority populations. So this is the Hermansky HPS, I'm not going to try to pronounce the other name, network, and this is actually, that's the lady who formed it. She's I think a former RN whose daughter actually suffers from this condition. And basically through sheer strength of will, she created this network of this incredibly rare disorder, and organizes a conference and was even able to get enough people together to recruit for a orphan drug clinical trial. And what's interesting about HPS is that a lot of the sufferers actually live in Puerto Rico, because there's sort of a founder effect there. And so these networks, which are digital, have allowed her to not only stay in contact, but also recruit individuals for clinical trials out of far-flung places like Puerto Rico. And another great story, actually, Urmila Sarkar at SFGH at UCSF actually is one of their digital health experts and a primary care physician too, and she loves to tell the story of one of her patients who is Spanish-speaking and has a mother with severe dementia, and it's incredibly isolating for her because she's unable to, speak, language at a level of sophistication that would enable her to interact with some of her difficult, sensitive questions on some of these online boards. And she was able to actually find an online support group for caregivers of individuals with advanced dementia in Spanish language. And that was incredibly helpful for her because she didn't personally know anyone who she could share or ask questions for, but she was able to find that type of community online. Also, social media, certain types of social media make it easier to interact with people in big positions of fame or power. Here's a great one. This is Atul Gawande, who's a famous medical writer and a surgeon based out of Harvard Medical School. And one of his random fans said, "Hi Atul, sending you my sincerest thanks for taking the time to write your books." And I don't think she actually expected that he was going to reply, but and I think it makes you feel a little bit more connected, and makes you feel like some people are out there are actually listening. And then there's also peer support. It's not just about patients or people on different levels of power. There's also peer support and mentorship for us as healthcare providers and researchers. I put up these slides. So the aforementioned PLOS One study that I got published, these were my mentors on it, Dr. Chris Longnecker and Dr. Allison Wiebel, and they're based out of Cleveland Clinic. So I've actually only met them in person twice, and yet we were able to conduct a research study based out of Uganda by working together with digital tools. But in lieu of things like traditional lab meetings, Dr. Wiebel tags me on tweets of interesting or relevant papers. And so in this way, we were able to e-mentor people and actually produce, hopefully compelling research leveraging existing technologies like this. And as Kira mentioned, I'm in global health, and so for me, distance is a huge issue. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed the most about my experiences in global health is that I'm able to go work in low and middle income countries and help train residents and medical students. And you're able to stay in contact. So this is actually David Nyabo, who is was a medical student. He's now now a resident in Rwanda, and we've spent a month. I was his supervising resident on his team, and really for years thereafter, I've kept in contact not just with him, but other individuals that I supervised, providing both academic mentorship, but also personal mentorship. And it's, none of this would have been possible without these digital media, and so I've been basically e-mentoring people from East Africa. Other things that we can do and that are really good is education. So we can share healthy behavioral promotion. So here's the front office staff of our internal medicine residency program tweeting for Wear a Red Day to raise awareness for women's heart disease. You can amplify a message. So in the old days, you just talked with your individuals, but now because Twitter is wide open, you can amplify not only your message, other people's messages as well. So here's Dr. Ronald Wittelis. He's our program director of internal medicine, but he's also a cardiologist and directs the Stanford Amyloid Center, which is a pretty rare disease. So that's because that's his area. A lot of the things that he tweets or retweets have to do with amyloid, which is a relatively rare disease, but he's able to talk about his role as an expert in this and share this information with his peers as well as his with the public. Here's Dr. Mintu Tarakia, who's another one of my mentors. He's the director for the Center for Digital Health here. And here he's talking about a recent, I think this is the barbershop blood pressure study. So as you can see, the retweet and comment function is very useful for sharing these types of things. And then finally, we can connect with our peers. So this hashtag here, FOAMmed, or Free Open Access Medical Education. So people are tagging this to put medical education at the level of, say, medical students and residents. Conference live tweets are one of my favorite parts, and I know it kind of gets back to one of the questions from earlier about is it okay to. A lot of people are actually live tweeting conferences. So here's Alexander Perino, who's a cardiology fellow and former chief resident, and he's using here, this is AHA 17, so that was the official hashtag for, which was actually set, I believe, by AHA. So if you click on this, pretty much everyone who's using this, you can see all the content that's being generated by individuals having to do with the conference, and a lot of them are posters, and so you can, again, amplify message in real time. So let's say, here's Jimmy Tooley, who's one of our internal medicine residents. Let's say he had a really cool research idea that perhaps people did not recognize from those, gigantic telephone book looking conference abstract manuals. You could be like, oh, this looks really cool. We'll be able to check it out. And also what's great is not only is this great during a conference, right, because I only have one body, so I can only sit in one session, and so I can follow what's happening in a different section, or if it's more compelling, I could potentially go over and see that session. But also, I can follow this at home. So even if I'm not able to go to a conference that year, like I'm getting real-time, data about the latest breaking clinical trials, or some impressive, insights that individuals who are at that conference can share. And so I think, conference live tweets within the academic community are definitely very well accepted as one of the strengths of social media. And then there's also activism and awareness. There's a lot of really, really important messages that have been able to be spread. So some common examples, I look like a surgeon was a really big thing about raising awareness for women in the surgical fields. And so this went viral where individuals, surgeons all across the country, women surgeons took this photo that mimicked the cover of a New Yorker magazine cover. And so we had individuals sharing that from Stanford, multiple actually different surgical divisions. There's one for general surgery and one for orthopedic surgery, I think, and across institutions as well, too. Here's WIC for Women in Cardiology. There's Fatima Rodriguez, who's one of our attending physicians in cardiology here, and she's very active in that community. And then this is the handle for Esther Chu, who is a academic ER doctor based out of OHSU. And she kind of rocketed to prominence because when the Charlottesville demonstrations were happening, she actually shared her experiences as a ER physician treating patients who are white supremacists. And Twitter was really able to kind of amplify that message and bring a voice to physicians who normally, are kind of taught to stay out of, of current events and politics. But, as we all know, the intersection between them is you can't break that. And so it's allowed for a lot of really powerful message amplification here. And we've only actually started scratching the surface of what social media can do for us. So, for example, natural disasters, I mentioned earthquakes earlier, but we actually saw that happen in real time for Hurricane Harvey. So, does everyone remember the Cajun Navy? Yeah, so for people who weren't aware, so during Hurricane Harvey, there was a ton of flooding, and due to the sheer scale of everything, traditional rescue and search and rescue avenues like 911 were completely overwhelmed by calls and did not have the manpower. And so a bunch of volunteer individuals from nearby Louisiana and the Bayou all got out their boats and said, we're going to go out and try to help and find people and bring them to safety. And not only was that largely organized on media like Facebook and Twitter, this is actually really cool. They built a Google Maps-based, rescue map for that these individuals used. And what this uses is this aggregates information from Twitter and Facebook. So each one of these points is actually an individual either tweeting or putting up on Facebook, I need help, where my address is and who am I and what kind of help do I need. And doing this allowed a largely basically crowdsourced rescue effort to be able to prioritize and figure out who to find and where to go to find these individuals, which is pretty powerful. And on the flip side, social media during Hurricane Harvey allowed people to offer services. So a lot of places, small business owners said, for people who have nowhere else to go, I am turning my place of business into a shelter tonight. And all they needed was a Twitter account or a Facebook account. And just, as we mentioned before, by putting a hashtag, now anyone who needs to find housing can use that to find individuals. And this is actually the Twitter account for Doctor on Demand, which is a telemedicine application that was founded by Dr. Ian Tong, who's one of the former chief residents here and was on faculty here before taking over this role full time. And it's a telemedicine application. And during the Hurricane Harvey, they actually offered their services for free. So any individuals affected, either who had medical questions or needed to speak with a mental health professional, could access this application and would have their fees waived and be able to. So the other thing that's really wonderful about social media is that it allows connections between different types of I guess, technology venues, for example, app-based innovations. And public demonstrations of activism. We got really hung up on the fact that, in many ways our participatory democracy was undermined by social media. But never forget, a lot of the things like the Women's March, the March for Our Lives, March for Science, were and continue to be organized and created on Facebook and Twitter. And since this is a talk to the research community, at the end of the day, we do want to know, how do we use social media for research purposes? And one possible way is that you can use it to recruit for clinical trials or research studies. So again, it's a cool study in JMIR, which actually used Facebook to recruit for a cool autoimmune hepatitis genomics repository. And they actually found that it saved them a lot of time and money, because instead of having to go out and hunt out people, they were able to identify individuals and reach out to them on Facebook. Of course, they did note that there was some sampling bias, as you can always imagine, and there was some self-reported information that was sometimes unreliable. But as you can imagine, we are using an existing network on an existing platform that people are already using, so can make recruitment of patients that much easier. And also, we can understand a little bit more about our patients and then potential research subjects, specifically qualitative, but also some quantitative research on the patient experience. So this is another publication in JMIR by Sid Sinha is the senior author. He's one of the GI attendings here at Stanford. And he used social media to characterize the public sentiment towards medical interventions commonly used for cancer screening. And it was kind of interesting because what they did was they built some algorithms to help them understand attitudes. Were they positive or were they negative, and figure out the ratio. And what they found was that it wasn't all bad. I mean, colonoscopy, people were pretty unexcited. The negative to positive ratio is 1.65. But mammography, actually, people were pretty positive about it. And pap smears, people were pretty neutral about. And so what's also cool is that they then went a little bit deeper to try to understand why it was that, that certain modalities were more positively seen or more negatively seen. And what they found was that the positive tweets tended to show that people recognized that there was benefit to screening, whereas the negative tweets tended to primarily use language showing that people were afraid of pain or discomfort. So that kind of explains why things like colonoscopy or pap smears, which might be more invasive than mammography, had negative, I guess, tweet connotations. And then you can even take a little bit further and look at epidemiology and the contents of tweets, because there's just so much data. I mean, this is the ultimate in big data, can predict disease epidemiology. So this is another really cool study where they actually looked, this is Eichstadt and colleagues, and so what they did was they actually looked at the, I guess, emotional attributes of tweets. and they were able to then look at that and overlay that on a map showing the density of heart disease mortality. And sure enough, negative associated emotions and negatively associated words on tweets were very predictive, in terms of correlating with heart disease mortality. So I think, again, there's some wisdom to be gained in the cloud. And then last but not least, the ultimate holy grail, which is, can we actually use social media as a healthcare delivery tool in and of itself? I think we are starting to move towards that. So for example, Facebook and other companies as well recently started making a move to create AI to recognize and intervene on social media use concerning for suicidality. For example, there's a recent publication that talked about, I think the title was something like, Siri, what if I want to hurt myself? And a lot of these social networks didn't have answers, and so after this, public shaming of sorts, all of a sudden, all of these companies actually built AI algorithms. So, for example, I think I want to say Facebook, I think, or if you use trigger words that are associated with suicidality, it prompts the algorithm to automatically suggest, here's a phone number for a helpline, or here's where you can find out more. And so I think there is some potential for this, and certainly the powers that be are hoping to leverage that. One of my friends and colleagues here, Adam Miner, looks at artificial intelligence and what that tells us, about natural language processing and the structure of written language, which could potentially be used to power things like this. And also, we talked a little bit about the research suggesting that social media use is bad for you and leads to negative emotional states. But what I didn't tell you at the time is that that's actually only telling one part of the story. So, for example, the studies then go on a little bit further and say it's not really just blanket the use of social media, but how you use social media that drives, the depression, the anxiety, the social isolation. Because a lot of the studies showed that it was really the passive use and the unidirectional access of data that makes us feel sad or anxious or alone. As you can understand, when you're looking from afar, it's at a stranger who, their life seems more beautiful than yours, and it's obviously a very made-up construct, but that can affect you. And on the flip side, there have been some studies that actually looked specifically at individuals using social media actively, whether they're sharing or they're commenting, and specifically chatting with loved ones or close friends. And those studies actually found that people felt happier afterwards, and they felt more connected, they felt more heard. And I think, if we think about it, that also makes sense that ultimately that's what social media is about connecting us with individuals. So if we try to figure out how we can leverage the patterns of use, perhaps we'll be able to fight the bad vibes and actually rechannel social media for the good that we had all hoped that it would be when it first came. So other things, fortunately, the professional societies are catching on. So find your professional society. Most of them now are releasing guidelines on social media usage, and some even on research. And of course, there's legal regulation as well. I mean, part of the reason why we got into this mess in the first place is because we had way too much optimism about the innovation, and so there wasn't nearly enough regulation in the sense that we let the networks police themselves. And I think one of the things that we've seen over the course of the past few days on Capitol Hill is that I think due to especially public outcry about our loss of faith in these companies, there will probably be more external regulation coming in as well too. And as I mentioned before, there can be too much of a good thing, whether that's snack foods or fast cars. And so there is precedent, for us regulating these types of things. So then I'm actually going to present in our remaining time some controversial points on how I think we should fix it from a structural perspective as a research or healthcare infrastructure. First thing, I think we should make social media training programs mandatory for health researchers as well as students. Again, overnight almost, when we put on our badge or our white coats or graduate from school, we're seen as people who have very specialized knowledge, and the public treats us like that. And yet, and every one of us has social media accounts, but, not a whole lot of people have actually been formally trained in what to do and what not to do about it. And, before you say that's crazy, how would you even do that? We have done it, actually, and we do that for ethical conduct of research. In the 80s and 90s, after there were some potentially embarrassing ethics breaches on the way that we conduct research, now the NIH actually mandates that if you do human subject research, you have to take a course on the ethical conduct of research. I certainly did as part of my research in my master's program, and I actually really enjoyed it. And so I think there's some precedent that we can train the next generation of researchers and healthcare providers who are social media savvy. And this is also a little controversial. I think we already verify accounts. I think we should verify posts and content as well too. And I'm not saying, that content that doesn't get verified, gets thrown into the trash. But I think some issues deserve to be weighed more heavily than others, especially on very controversial topics. And so I think, we should have content approval. And I don't think it really matters whether it's in-house or with consultant scientists, but I think this could go a long way in helping increase the trust, rebuilding the public's trust in information that they encounter on social media. And then a lot of this stuff is kind of about big picture policy questions, and so I think I'm going to transition at the very end about asking, how can I as an individual help improve the system and basically not be like this guy over here. I think first, maintain positivity. So, we all know the negative effects of social media, so don't feed it. Maintain positivity. Don't get into arguments with people. There are always two losers. Respond with kindness, regardless of how people initially approach you, or don't respond at all. I've found that, for example, that reading the comments section on certain articles is more likely to get me emotionally worked up because I will read opinions written by complete strangers that I disagree with, and so sometimes it's better not to respond at all and stick with the sources that you know and you trust as a starting point. Next, be a good citizen. So if you notice that someone in your department or a colleague or a friend is new, share or retweet their posts and help amplify their message. There's a vertical mentorship element that you can have on social media that really transcends discipline and institution that you can be a part of. Generate new content where possible. Retweeting is great, but if you've got something cool to share, you should totally do it. And when you do share it, make sure that you always include a citation. Don't be a part of the 85 egg and oil, olive oil hair people. And then it shouldn't be up here, but it always needs to be up here. It's protect patient privacy, especially given our role in the healthcare system. We need to protect patient privacy, and you can lose your job. And people have lost their jobs over social media privacy breaches. So don't do that. And next, I think it's on us. If we recognize that the social media outlets themselves don't have the power to police these things, I think it's really up to us as people who understand these things to do it. So we have to fight fake news, bots, and bad behavior. So there is a report function if a post does show erroneous information or malicious intent. All the social media outlets have their terms of service, and so if you see someone violating it, or if you see someone posting in an erratic manner that may reveal that they're a bot, or if they're saying things that are very, very clearly not true, you can report these things, and that sort of channels the policing function a little bit and prioritizes. I try to make it a habit that whenever I'm on these things, if I see something that's very clearly fake news, I report it. And there's a nice feedback loop too. Oftentimes I do find out that certain accounts were determined to be bots or were found to be fake news and were removed. So there is the process can work. Here's another interesting thing. Google yourself periodically, because you may be surprised to see what you find. So there are so many of these rating sites nowadays. So this is one of my health grades. And so here I am, I found myself. Fortunately, no one has commented on me yet. I don't know what that means for me as a physician, but no one. But I certainly have Googled my friends, and there are some very interesting comments that some people, both good and bad, place. But I also say this because it had my cell phone number on it, and I had no idea that this is the case. I think it had to do with the fact that a lot of this information is automatically reported from, I guess, publicly available or publicly reported things. So I can only assume that that came from another application that I had to say, the California Department of, Health or, our MPI numbers, for example, are all up there. So these things are very easily linked and can be automated. So, so definitely Google yourself. You may be very, very surprised. And the nice thing, though, is all these sites do have a means for you to report these things. So as soon as I found these things, I messaged everybody and said, please take this number off. I did not, consent and do not want this up there. And sure enough, within the week, all of them were gone. So be very careful to Google yourself and find out what information about you is being posted online. Yes. That's actually that's a very tricky question, and I think part of it, I was on a great roll with all the nice things, and part of it is again, it's the good parts and bad parts, and I think unfortunately, in the case specifically for Twitter as well too, I think there have been many instances of Donald Trump clearly violating the terms of service, and yet he's allowed to keep his account, and part of it is he's revenue generating, but I think part of it for us is that it's up to us to keep hammering away at these things until Twitter gets the message. And hopefully with additional regulation, things can change. Again, outside the scope of this, but there's a book being released on it's called The New Power, about power dynamics, and it discusses some very interesting things about social media, about old power versus new power. And their argument is new power is crowdsourcing, is user-generated content, and old power is old business and old political systems. And the fundamental issue we're having right now with things like Twitter and Facebook is they are new power products that are being administered by old power businesses and old power business structures. And so one of the things that that kind of logically follows is when you have that disconnect, you have things like that happening. But potentially there are social networks, for example, that are being put forth and hypothesized where what if we had user-generated content that is owned by the users, where we can decide ultimately that if someone violates the terms of service that that we kick them out, because at the end of the day, the content is not being generated to create shareholder wealth for a corporation, right? So it's a difficult question, but yeah, it's tough. Great. All right, and then last but not least, be professional. One of the questions, the most common questions that a lot of people have about social media and yourself as an academic is how do you draw the line? And the answer is you got to draw it, or you got to stay on one side of it. So a good example is if your account is in any way associated with work, it shows you, with anything having to do with Stanford, if it says anything on the profile about your affiliation, you are representing the institution. So, so that's a professional account, and so that's how you do it. And what's actually interesting is if you read, say, the AMA's, the American Medical Association's take on this, they say, if you want a private and a public account, then you could just make two accounts. You can make another account which doesn't have your professional work affiliations written on it. And that's one way to avoid it. And certainly I do have friends and people I look up to who have separate accounts where they say, this is my personal account, that's what I'm keeping it as, and this is my professional account, and they don't mix. So that's one way of dealing with it. I know these are our day jobs, but don't give out medical advice or research protocol advice information online, because we don't know who people are if they are who they say they are. And if you do get asked, definitely redirect patients to appropriate medical resources, such as 911 or hospitals or local clinics. And if it happens to be your patients who are asking you questions, then ask them very politely, reach out to you on an established mode of communication, whether that's a clinic phone or a secure messaging or My Health or things like that. And generally people are pretty reasonable about these things. And again, I can't say this and I can't emphasize this enough. If your profile reflects your academic affiliation, you are never off the clock. And that has to do with some of the personal stuff too. For example, you shouldn't be posting photos of smoking, if you're a pulmonologist, right? Or a pediatric nurse. So, think before you post about these things. And it's a unique consideration that we have to have because we wear both hats. We're not, working in an industry where, say, that's not a consideration. I think I am perfectly right on time, so here's where you can find me on the various forms of the internet. Great. Thank you guys so much for listening.
Okay, so we have about 30 minutes left, and I wanted to invite Manjeet Gill from the Research Compliance Office to join us up here. We have 30 minutes for a Q&A session. We thought that you all might have some questions related to the use of social media and participant recruitment specifically. So wanted to invite Manjeet here today. Unfortunately, the Privacy Office could not join us, but if you have questions specifically related to the use of social media and recruitment tactics, that's why Manjeet is here to answer those questions. So I'll start off. We had one question from Jerry O'Riordan from CV Med who could not join today but wanted to ask about the use of Twitter and trying to recruit participants into studies. So I'll start us off with that question. And before I forget, please sign in before you leave, and there will be an evaluation that I send. So please complete that. It helps us with the next course. But we'll start off with that question.
Thank you. It's a little difficult to answer Jerry's question without her being here because I think I need more details about the studies. For advertising on social media, the requirements for advertising any study, it applies regardless of the platform. So it doesn't matter if you're using social media. So for Twitter, it would really depend on what you're posting and how you're using Twitter. So are you just, saying this study is available, go to this link, and then it links to a web page that has more information about the study, and that's already been reviewed and approved by the IRB. That's fine. Or are you putting more information on Twitter about the study directly? So it really depends on how you're planning on using the platform to advertise and what information you're providing. Any other questions?
I can't be the only person. It's even my program. I figured more people would want to know about the use of social media. Anybody have any other questions?
I'm trying to think of... it happens pretty often. So the roles between social media versus just any other type of advertisement, they're not that different. We need to see what you're posting. We need to see how it's going to be used. Is it the sole source of recruitment? The main thing is just making sure anything you post is approved by the IRB first, because we look at the text of it. It's not just that you're allowed to post anything on Twitter. You just say that and then you're approved flat across. No, we need to look at the text. Yeah.
Are there guidances around not engaging with that language?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, again, it depends on how you're using the page, but one of the things we say is look at the settings, make sure that people's comments aren't going to be public, that there's someone who reviews the content first before it gets posted. So we wouldn't, the researcher's team, if they have their own page that they've created for this study, someone from the study team has to be reviewing what people are saying, the comments, before it's allowed to be posted on that page. So there has to be a way to monitor the comments that are being posted.
Right, I guess I'm asking necessarily
Yeah, and that's one of the questions we would ask. Do you have the training to be monitoring that appropriately? Some of the main things we look for or we would ask about is making sure people aren't posting things about other people's health information and making that available. Making sure that they're not posting something about themselves, which you wouldn't necessarily want to share with everyone. So it is something we would actually ask is what training do you have to be able to do this monitoring? And that's something that you would have to look into before actually using that as a platform. Yeah. Yeah. That is part of it. Again, just the recruitment in general training, because there's a lot of, through City, I think they talk about recruitment. City training talks about recruitment. There's different sessions here about recruitment. So going through that. Also, Facebook has their own terms and conditions about what can be posted, how things can be monitored, making sure you're complying with that as well. Those are probably the main things, the main sources to make sure. And then a lot of it is, the discretion of the study team. If you think something's not right, then it probably shouldn't be posted. Yeah. Yeah.
Also a question about research teams using or going on to support group Facebook pages and what that interaction should be and shouldn't be. Can you speak a little bit about how researchers should and can interact with support groups in the interest of trying to recruit?
Yeah, that's tricky. So you'd have to get permission from the support group, whoever owns that web page or whatever platform you may be using. You have to get permission from them to post your study or to recruit from it. That's the first thing. And then we would still need to see how the plan for how you're going to do that, because people need to know that. I think the biggest complaint the IRB gets is, how did you find out that I have this condition, or how did you find out this information about me? So if they have the permission from the support group and you can turn around and say, well, the support group allows us to post these types of things, then it's fine. So that's the main thing there. Yeah. It's probably not just about recruitment and a study though, right? They're just posting, like, oh, and posting that. Yeah, I mean, if they're taking pictures and posting it somewhere else, you can't really control that. So that's fine. But if people contact you about it, then that's where you're responsible for making sure they have the accurate information.
Before we wrap up?
Oh, yeah. That's actually interesting. There's been a lot of sponsored studies lately where the sponsor has put something in the consent form saying, please, if you're going to participate in this study, please refrain from posting anything about the study on social media. And so it really, again, depends on the study. If they choose to say, I'm participating in something, that's fine. You can't really control that, right? But again, if there's something in the consent form or if the sponsor has said we don't want people to post about this, then you are responsible for making sure that they're not doing that. And if you catch that or if you find that out, that is something that would be an issue.
Very good. Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
Please again sign